Kiri Kankwende, and I'm Head of Press and Public Affairs at CSW. In this one-hour webinar, we're exploring the question of why Christians should be at the forefront of speaking up for those of other faiths who are experiencing religious persecution and mistreatment. While this session is aimed primarily at church leaders, we're sure that it will be hugely helpful to you all. This is the first in a series of 3 events hosted by the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, Bishop of Truro, and Marvin Thomas, CMG, founder-president of CSW. Prior to becoming the 16th Bishop of Truro, Bishop Philip was the executive leader of the Church Mission Society, enabling networking across the Anglican Communion and beyond. In December 2018, he was asked by the then Foreign Secretary to investigate how well or otherwise the Foreign Office was responding to the issue of the global persecution of Christians. The recommendation of the subsequent report were accepted in full by the UK government. Bishop Philip retains a significant interest in this area and also chairs the Church of England's Partnership for World Mission, the umbrella body which gathers together the Church of England's various specialist mission agencies. Marvin Thomas is the founder-president of CSW, a Christian human rights organisation standing with those facing injustice for their beliefs and advocating for freedom of religion or belief. He is also chair of the UK Forum Steering Group and works closely with the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on freedom of religion or belief. He has testified in the UK Parliament, at the EU and within the US Congress, as well as speaking in churches of all denominations, inspiring Christians to take a stand for against injustice. For this first event, we're also delighted to welcome as a guest panelist, His Eminence Archbishop Angelos, Coptic Orthodox Archbishop of London. He is widely recognized for his extensive advocacy work, and as a result was conferred the honor of Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for services to international religious freedom. Among other roles, His Eminence is President of the Bible Society, co-founder and co-chair of the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative, and the Orthodox President of Churches Together in England. With a pastoral ministry spanning more than 2 decades, he specializes in youth ministry and travels around the world to speak at youth conferences and conventions. We will have time for a Q&A, so please do add your questions throughout the seminar into the Q&A function chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can later on. So now, without further ado, I'll hand over to the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, who's going to begin by exploring the theology of speaking up for freedom of religion or belief for all. Over to you.
Thank you, Kiri, very much indeed, and welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us for this seminar. I just want to emphasize what the focus of this particular seminar is, and it is helping us to think through why Christians should be at the forefront of speaking up for people of all faiths and none who experience religious persecution and mistreatment. I hope we are increasingly sensitized within the church in this country to the issues that our persecuted brothers and sisters in the Christian church face worldwide, and rightly so, although there's certainly more sensitization that needs to go on. But the critical question that we're going to try and address today is why we should be at the forefront of speaking up for people of other faiths, and indeed people who don't believe, but who experience persecution, sometimes because of what they believe, or indeed because of what they don't believe. Why should Christians specifically be concerned about that kind of issue? And indeed, it has to be said that in the minds of some, that commitment to advocate for freedom of religion or belief for everyone, excuse me, without fear or favor, can be contentious. There was a piece written by a prominent American commentator who recently was sharply critical of our doing so, and suggested that somehow it was a betrayal of the gospel to speak up for people of other faiths, and that it suggested that somehow we valued all faiths alike, and we saw them all as different roads to the one God. That kind of thing. You're probably familiar with that kind of argument. So, as I say, there is no doubt that advocating for freedom of religion or belief for all can be contentious. I want to explore why that is, but also I want to show why it is essential I believe that we should do so. So one reason that it's contentious is that something that our focus should be exclusively on the persecuted church. Now, there are some fantastic organizations that Merv and I and Archbishop Angelos work closely with, who do focus very specifically on the persecuted church. To give you just two examples, Aid to the Church in Need, a Roman Catholic charity, and Open Doors, founded by Brother Andrew. They have a very clear focus on the persecuted church. And I don't want to be seen remotely to be critical of them for doing so. That is their focus, and indeed that is their calling. But I also want to say those organizations would certainly not say that we should not advocate for freedom of religion or belief for everyone. Very, very far from it. Indeed, I can't think, if I'm honest, of any biblical reason as to why focusing on freedom of religion or belief for everyone is wrong. Let's look at one particular verse. Galatians 6:10 says this: "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." Now, there's clearly an emphasis there on looking after our brothers and sisters in Christ. But you can't use a verse like that as an argument for us to be exclusive in our support for our Christian brothers and sisters, precisely because it says, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So yes, it's entirely understandable that as Christians, we should have a particular heart for our brothers and sisters who suffer. But I don't think certainly that verse gives us any warrant to be exclusive in our concern. As I said, another objection is that in advocating for freedom of religion or belief for everyone, we're guilty of syncretism, of treating every religion as the same. And furthermore, therefore, the argument is extended to suggest that campaigning for freedom of religion or belief for everyone is somehow antithetical to evangelism, that it stands in the way of sharing our faith with people of other faiths. Now, not only can I see no particular logic to that argument, I would argue that campaigning for freedom of religion or belief for everyone actually enables evangelism. Central to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the right not just to hold a faith, or indeed not to hold a faith, but critically, the right to change faith as well. So when we campaign for freedom of religion or belief for everyone, that involves campaigning for people's right to change their faith. And indeed, campaigning therefore for a culture and a society in which sharing one's faith freely with other people so that they can change faith becomes possible. So I see no contradiction at all between advocating for freedom of religion or belief for everyone and being passionate about sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with everyone. Indeed, I would say that we have a God-given right to choose what and who we believe in, and we need to treat people as responsible and ensure that they have the freedom to make that choice. We look at Genesis 1:2. We don't see the man God creates as some kind of automaton. God gives Adam instructions, and those instructions presuppose the ability to choose to obey or not. The man who God creates, the man and woman who God creates, have agency and ability. The man can choose what to call the animals that the Lord brings to him. The Lord doesn't tell him how to fill the earth and subdue it. He has to decide, to discover how to do that for himself. So this ability to choose is hardwired, I believe, into the Christian understanding of creation. Now, of course, the man and the woman make a disastrous choice. Excuse me, but the consequence of that is not then that the Lord removes their ability to choose. Indeed, the story of the Old Testament is in many ways the story of the Lord pleading and persuading, wooing and cajoling his people to make a better choice and to choose him. And the story of the New Testament is the story of people making a free choice to follow Jesus in their own time. Indeed, there would be no church at all if people did not have the freedom to choose to follow him. No one in the end can be coerced into believing, and nor should anyone ever try. Freedom of religion or belief matters for everyone, everywhere, because it enables people to make a free choice in terms of what and who they believe in, and it certainly enables people, if they wish, to make a free choice to follow Jesus Christ. Now, of course, as Kiri said at the beginning, I was asked to lead a review into the way that the Foreign Office had responded to the issue of the persecution of Christians specifically. So you might wonder why, given I was asked to do that, I now advocate passionately for freedom of religion or belief for everyone. Well, from the very start, I deliberately framed my justification for engaging in the work of the review on the basis of freedom of religion or belief for everyone. In other words, I was never going to do anything exclusively about Christians. One reason I did that was that I knew that if my recommendations were going to have traction in a liberal plural society, then I needed to make that commitment. But I think there are other reasons that it's worth citing why I did that. So I argued that Christians had missed out. I argued that we've been blind to this issue, and the suffering of Christians has been woefully overlooked. So a focus on the persecuted church was deserved. But I also was very clear that this was not about special pleading for Christians. It's not about privileging Christians over other persecuted faiths. Rather, it was about ensuring that Christians in the global south particularly had a fair deal and a fair share of the UK's attention and concern. So I said it was an equality issue, and I was arguing for suffering Christians to have no less attention than anyone else. But I certainly was not arguing for an exclusive focus on Christians. And indeed, I also argued that because the Christian faith is perhaps the one truly global faith, it's become what you might call a bellwether for repression more generally. If Christians are being discriminated against in one context or another, you can bet your bottom dollar other minorities are too. So renewing a focus on Christian persecution was actually a way of sensitizing us to and expressing our concern for all minorities who find themselves under pressure. And if we ignore Christian persecution in one context or other, it may well mean that we're ignoring other forms of repression as well that go alongside it. So then to sum up, I was and I remain convinced that there are good reasons, both practically and theologically, for arguing for freedom of religion or belief for everyone. But, ultimately, and this is perhaps particularly appropriate in this Holy Week in the run-up to Easter, the run-up to the Western Easter, for me, ultimately, the key justification for us focusing on freedom of religion or belief for everyone, without fear or favor, lies in the person and in the work of Jesus Christ himself. And I think it is ultimately Jesus who calls us to advocate for freedom of religion or belief for everyone. One key justification for saying that lies in these words of Jesus, words you know well, I'm sure, at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Which of these three, do you think, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Jesus asked. He replied, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Now, what Jesus is doing in the parable of the Good Samaritan, as you know, is really very radical and very challenging, because he is defining our neighbor in the widest possible terms. Our neighbor is not just the one who is near us and like us, but the one who is distant from us and different to us. And it is such people that Jesus calls us to love and to serve, and we must not fail to do so. But think too about the cross, which will be our focus this Good Friday. In one of our Anglican prayers, we talk about the way that Jesus opened wide his arms upon the cross. And the cross is God's loving, heartbreaking embrace of all humanity, in our wretchedness and sin, as Jesus bears the weight of the whole world's sin on his shoulders. And I want to say unequivocally that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that all that believe in him should not perish, but have eternal life. God so loved the world. The death of Jesus is not a limited thing. The death of Jesus is a comprehensive thing. God so loved the world, all its peoples, everywhere, at all time. And I want to stand up for freedom of religion or belief for everyone without fear or favor, to express myself the breadth of God's love, and indeed to ensure that all people everywhere have the opportunity to believe in Jesus and find liberty, life, and love in him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop Philip, especially for that, just that poignant reminder of God's love as we approach Holy Week here in the West. Please remember to add your questions in the Q&A function. You can do that throughout the event, and we'll come around to those again at the Q&A in the end. I'm now going to hand over to Marvin, who will share about a couple of situations in the world today where CSW is working for freedom of religion or belief for all. Marvin.
Thanks very much, Kerry, and thank you, Bishop Philip, for that. The call to us to, as Christians, to speak up for people of all faiths, and you know, one of the reasons that we called that Philip and I decided to do these seminars, these series of seminars, because we believe that this is something that is not widely practiced by Christians and not widely understood either, the importance of speaking up. And so, you know, we so often talk about the persecuted church from our pulpits, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we do also need to widen our vocabulary and not only to speak about our brothers and sisters in Christ, but to speak about those that are different from us too, those who Bishop Philip has just told us are our neighbours. I want to start off just by giving you a very brief history of how I got to where I am in this situation today. When I started CSW with some friends back in, some members of Parliament back in 1979, all those years ago, the reason we founded CSW was because we wanted to respond to the persecution of Christians in Eastern Europe, what was then the Soviet Union, what we called the Eastern Bloc countries. There was lots of information available about Christians who were persecuted, who were imprisoned, who were martyred for their faith. And so we decided we wanted to speak up for them, in accordance with Proverbs 31, that tells us we're to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. And so we started off doing that right at the very beginning. But then 10 years later, in 1989, we found that suddenly communism collapsed all over Europe. Those of you who are old enough will remember that. Suddenly, overnight almost, Christians were free to go about their normal lives. And although sadly some of that began to go backwards again in recent years, but nevertheless, overnight things changed. And so we had to look around the rest of the world. Is there more persecution than Eastern Europe? Of course, the answer was yes. And we soon found that there were many countries, and CSW now works in 25 countries where Christians are persecuted. But as we were working in Burma or Myanmar at the time, I remember our staff member coming to me and saying, look, you know, we're speaking up for these Christian groups, the Karen and the Karenni and the Chin and the Kachin, Christian ethnic groups, but there's another group that is just as persecuted, and they're called the Rohingya. And but the problem is the Rohingya are Muslims. As Christians, should we be speaking up for them? And of course, it was a no-brainer. Of course, we had to speak up for them. But I was never sure how well our supporters would understand that. And so later on we explored the biblical reasons why we should do that. And of course, Philip has very ably this morning given us some of the biblical imperative for doing what we're doing. And so now we speak up for people of all faiths and none, because indeed there are atheists who are persecuted for their faith and even executed in some countries. So that's where I arrived. That's how I arrived. That's how CSW arrived at where we are today, speaking up for people of all faiths and none. 84% of the world's population, according to Pew, 84% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom, and that's people of all faiths. But just briefly this morning, I want to focus on two countries. First of all, China. Many of you will know about the situation in the Xinjiang province, the Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, where estimates suggest that since 2017, somewhere between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs, which is a predominantly Muslim ethnic group, have been detained without charge in so-called re-education camps. Whilst detentions are primarily ethnic, there is a strong religious element. And you could end up, for example, in a re-education camp for attending a religious meeting, reading religious content online, praying, wearing Islamic clothing, having WhatsApp on your phone, or having relatives who live abroad. What an incredible list. And I guess that everyone here today, if that were applied to us, would be found guilty on at least one of those counts. Families are torn apart as parents are sent to the camps and children are taken away to state orphanages where they will quite probably never see their families again. Inside the camps, the conditions are overcrowded and unsanitary, and there are numerous reports of brutal torture, ill treatment, systematic rape, of forced abortion, and even forced sterilization of the women. One person who is believed to be currently held in these conditions is the retired Uyghur doctor Gulshan Abbas. Dr. Abbas lost contact with her family in September 2018 after she disappeared from her home city of Urumqi. She's now been detained for over 3.5 years, and her family had no information regarding her whereabouts or well-being until they learned that she'd been sentenced to 20 years in prison on unfounded charges of terrorist activities. And that was in December 2020. In other words, it was almost 2 years before they even learned what had happened to her. Dr. Abbas will turn 60 in June, and she has multiple chronic diseases, and they require constant monitoring and medical treatment. Her daughter, Ziba Murat, has been a tireless advocate for her release. And CSW arranged for Ziba to be at the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council, where she reminded us that she is just one of many other Uyghur daughters and sons who have been left without information about disappeared or wholly innocent loved ones. President Xi Jinping has made it his mission to repress all religion, not only mosques and churches, not only mosques, but churches and Buddhist temples have been torn down too throughout China. Leaders imprisoned and congregations forced to recite atheist slogans and propaganda as they worship. Just last month, the government introduced new regulations on sharing religious content online that effectively ban anything from sending a WhatsApp message with a prayer request all the way through to online meetings, not unlike this one. Face recognition cameras are placed in some churches in China because actually, you know, there are 5 groups of people that are not allowed to attend church, even in state-recognized churches. If you're a government employee, if you're a Communist Party member, if you're a member of the armed forces, or if you're a student at university or a minor under the age of 18, you're not allowed to attend church. And face recognition cameras are able to compare faces in the churches with those on identity cards. When we see what is happening to Muslims and Buddhists and followers of Falun Gong, each one made, as Bishop Philip has already said to us, each one made in God's image, it's unimaginable, surely, that we only speak up for the Christians. Second country I want to briefly mention is that of Pakistan. And of course, China, it's the government persecuting the Christians. But in Pakistan, it's a societal violence, but it's societal violence that is likely to have been inspired by harmful rhetoric that comes and emboldens extremist elements in society, harmful rhetoric that comes from the government. One of the most disturbing examples of this is seen in the abduction and forced marriage and conversion of religious minority girls in the country. The majority of these girls are either Hindu or Christian, and they are usually forcibly converted to Islam and then married off to their abductors. Last month, Pooja Kumari, an 18-year-old Hindu girl from Sindh province, was murdered in an attempted abduction. She was approached by a Muslim man who asked her to marry him. On refusing him, the man broke into her home along with two others and attempted to abduct her. And when their abduction attempt was resisted, they shot and killed her. In this particular case, the murderer was arrested, but very often justice eludes families like that of Pooja. The authorities are typically slow to hold perpetrators to account. Victims and their families are often intimidated by their abductors and their relatives. And often when a girl is taken, the parents know exactly where they're being held, but are too frightened to do anything about it, and the police won't help them. The Pakistani government must assess its own responsibility for creating the environment in which this form of Islamic extremism has been allowed to proliferate. The very recently deposed Prime Minister Imran Khan cozied up to many of the country's more conservative Islamic elements, promising not to pass laws that contradict Islam, essentially elevating a vision of Pakistan where to be a good Pakistani is to be a Sunni Muslim. This has had devastating impacts for many religious communities in the country, including in the recent suicide bomb attack targeting Shia Muslims, which at least 63 people were killed and nearly 200 were injured in Friday prayers. Again, although the government is not directly responsible for this, it's impossible not to draw links between harmful rhetoric that promotes intolerance and the subsequent violent acts of those emboldened by it. Let's pray that the very newly installed Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, has a very different approach. So these are just two countries where the situation for freedom of religion or belief remains dire. And of course, I could have mentioned the plight of many other groups in different countries of the world. But as I said, as Christian leaders, we need to speak not only about our brothers and sisters who are suffering, but also our neighbour. We are all made in the image of God. And I'm going to finish just by reading you a very short extract from a story recounted by a Pastor Erwin Lutzer, who lived as a young boy in Nazi Germany. And this is what he says. A railroad track ran behind our small church. And each Sunday morning we could hear the whistle in the distance and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by. We realized that it was carrying Jews like cattle in cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew that we'd hear also the cries of the Jews en route to death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the time the train was coming, and when we heard the whistle blow, we began singing hymns. By the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the tops of our voices. If we heard the screams, we simply sang more loudly, and soon we heard them no more. Although years have passed, I still hear the train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me. Forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians and yet did nothing to intervene. Friends, I believe that sums up where we are today. Let's not be found wanting in speaking up for others who are unable to express and live out their faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Merv, and just very powerful words there. Please remember, you can still add your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll cover as many as we can in the Q&A section at the end. I'm now going to hand over to Archbishop Angelos, our final contributor, who as leader of the Coptic Church has experienced persecution, will share some thoughts on how church leaders can respond practically.
Kiri, thank you so much, and it is wonderful to be able to follow my dear brothers, Bishop Philip and Mervin, and I have the greatest respect for what they both do on a quite literally on a daily basis on this topic that we're discussing. I suppose in considering this topic, it suddenly dawned on me that we speak so much about leadership as religious leaders, as Christian leaders, and don't speak as much about stewardship. When our Lord Jesus Christ came into the world, the incarnate Word, he didn't take up a position of leadership, he was a steward. He referred to himself as the Good Shepherd. He shepherded the flock, he walked alongside them, he felt their pain, he felt their hunger, he felt their sickness, he even experienced their death. And so he was able to retrieve us, and that's what this was all about. So the leadership we're trying to present as Christians is not about power or influence, but it is about stewardship and faithfulness. It is about a humbly walking with the Lord as we feel the pain and struggle of those around us. And if we're going to do that and walk in his footsteps, then I so value the words of Bishop Philip this morning about us following in those footsteps of love, the footsteps that express understanding, the footsteps that walk amongst the people and not despite them or around them, the footsteps that understand pain. I come from a church that has been persecuted for millennia, quite literally, from the time that the founder of Christianity in Egypt, St. Mark the Evangelist, died in the streets of Alexandria. Christians in Egypt have faced one kind of persecution or another. And so we understand. But what that does is it also makes us understand, makes me understand, that there is no way I can accept this suffering for anyone else. I cannot possibly, as a Christian, as a minister, as a steward, sit comfortably in my space, thinking, well, it is those other people who are suffering. You know, the story that Mervin just told us of people singing on top of their voices so they wouldn't hear the screams of people being carried across their space in a train. We can no longer do that. It may have been not excusable, but understandable 50 years ago when we all lived in silos, when a Coptic Christian would have lived in Egypt and nowhere else and only understood his or her own suffering. But that is no longer the case. We're exposed to each other's lives, we're exposed to each other's sufferings and struggles. And so as we walk in the footsteps of our Lord, and understand the struggles and pains of others, we can do nothing but emulate him. And I just want to look at a passage from the book of Genesis, speaking about God. For the Lord is your God, the God of God and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and takes no bribe. He administers justice for the fatherless, the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. That's just him. And if we're going to follow in his footsteps, that's what we must do. Experience, live, and advocate for indiscriminate love. He goes on to say, therefore, love the stranger. You think, okay, love the stranger. But why? For you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. As humankind, we have experienced estrangement and alienation and persecution when we were deprived of eternity. And it took the incarnate word, it took Christ among us, it took God in flesh to restore us. And that is what we know. We lived alienation. We lived displacement. And so when we look at the suffering of others, we look at Ukraine at the moment, and the millions displaced internally and externally. Wives, mothers, daughters, children, deprived of the presence of their fathers, their sons, their brothers, their uncles, either living somewhere else in the country or having left the country. The Uyghur communities in China, the Baha'i communities in Iran, the Yazidi communities in Iraq, the Shabak, the Christians and other faith communities in Afghanistan, the humanists in Pakistan. How can we sit in our comfort zone and just think, well, it's not really happening to me, so it's fine? The first thing is, it is happening to me because we share the image and likeness of God. The second is, it is certainly not fine. Because, as we've heard this morning, when you see countries executing partiality and persecuting communities, it is never the persecution of one community. It is a persecution of anyone who does not fit within the mold that is propagated as the norm. And so we can always find ourselves in that position. Men, women, children, young, old. We did live as captives, and we still live as captives. We still know that we fight a fight against that which we do not see. And yet our God does not stop advocating for us. I fear that there is an oversimplification sometimes of you are either doing outreach and mission and evangelizing, or you are doing advocacy, or you are dealing with hate crime, or you're dealing with freedom of religion or belief. In actual fact, the only way for us to look beyond all of that and to address all of this properly is to look at one point and one point alone. And that is human dignity in the humanity that was created by God. When God created humankind, he created humankind. All of us. None of us is preferred above anyone else in the eyes of God. He loves us equally. And as our sisters and brothers go towards celebrating Good Friday in a few days, and we celebrate it next week, and then beyond that, go to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord, we realize that it's not about partiality. Salvation came to all. And the freedom of choice that we heard about this morning is a double-edged sword. It is a wonderful thing that allows us to live in the image and likeness God created us. But it's also dangerous because it leads us to make bad decisions. And we can indeed reject God. But he doesn't stop us from that. And so, as someone who understands persecution, as someone who deals with it, and in my own calling, I started my ministry here 20 years ago, saying we need to advocate for Christians persecuted in Egypt. And then the Middle East started to implode. And I thought, well, actually, what about Christians in the Middle East? And then the world started to take a different direction. I thought, well, what about the Rohingya? What about the Uyghurs? What about the Baha'is? What about the Yazidis and the Shabak and the Hazara? And as a Christian, I could do nothing else but to advocate for these people, because they are our people. They are the people of God. Whatever shape, whatever size, whatever color, they continue to be people of God because they bear his image and likeness. What happens to us and what we choose and how we live, that is a decision for us to make personally. But our advocating must be indiscriminate and for all, in all cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Archbishop, and for that powerful reminder of seeing the image of God in all people. I actually think that dovetails quite nicely into our first question, which I will put to you, Archbishop. In fact, it's from David Wood Robinson. And he says, while of course we want to claim freedom of religion for all, how should we view those whose beliefs make them terrorists?
I did something quite odd after the attack of terrorists on people who are on a pilgrimage to go to a monastery for a baptism in Egypt. And I issued a statement called "You Are Loved." And it was addressed to the terrorists. Because God continues to love humankind, but hates the sin that we commit. And so our love must remain unwavering. And we have a concept in Christianity about love your enemy. And I struggle with that quite a lot. How can I have an enemy as a Christian? And it dawned on me that actually to love the person who considers him or herself your enemy. It's not enmity from my side. Why does he kill me except that he considers me an enemy? We love. But we stand against the acts of oppression. We stand against the violence. We call it for what it is. It is terrorism. And we have challenged sisters and brothers of other faiths to say, if you are a religious leader, please speak. Because if you're saying your texts are wholesome and yet they are being manipulated, I can't say that as a Christian. It must come from the source. And some do and some don't. Some faiths do call for violence, and I really dislike us as Christians saying, yeah, but look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament has been superseded by the New Testament. Our faith does not call for violence. Our faith calls us to be gracious in the face of violence. So let's please, brothers and sisters, not keep throwing that in our own faces, because it is not the truth. But when we see other things happening, we need to call for those who are considered authorities to speak against those texts.
Thank you. Our next question is...
Kiri, could I just...
Bishop Philip would like to add, and then perhaps Merv wants to add something as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, I echo everything that Archbishop said, but I think, of course, we don't campaign for those who would deny other people's freedom of religion or belief, whether that be terrorists or whether that be governments, actually. what we need to do is actually not campaign for them, but oppose them. Anyone who wants to deny someone else's freedom of religion or belief, whether that is a terrorist group or a government, that should be opposed quite clearly. The challenge in our spirituality is exactly as the Archbishop says. How do we continue to love those people? How do you love the Chinese Communist Party when it's doing what it does? But we have to recognize that loving someone and opposing someone at one and the same time, it may be an absolute imperative for us.
Yeah, I just add to even that last thing that both you and Archbishop has just said. Actually, in another part of the Bible, it doesn't just call us to love; it says we are to bless those who persecute us. That's even harder, but we won't unwrap that one. But that's what we are called to do: to bless those who persecute us. But I just wanted to add very, very briefly, what freedom of religion or belief is not about protecting religions. We are not here freedom of religion or belief is not the same as protecting what Islam believes, what Christianity believes, what Buddhism believes. It is protecting everybody's individual right to carry out to live their lives in accordance of what they believe. It's not protecting the religion. And of course, anybody who carries out acts of terrorism are breaking the criminal law. And of course, we could never condone that. And we would always, as Philip has just said, call that one out. Thank you.
Sorry, just one more thing. This is all about direct relationships. It's about relationship of God with individuals, with peoples. So no one is called, I'm just picking up on Bishop Philip, no one is called to love an institution. We are called to love individuals. We can say the institution is absolutely flawed, criminal, indefensible, but it's about individuals that we need to focus.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question and start with Bishop Philip, but as before, I would really welcome comments from the rest of the panel. The question is, do you personally find it difficult to find the right balance between being called as Christians to spread the gospel and also being called to speak up for people of other faiths? How do you navigate the two callings and decide whether to evangelize or to advocate for people of other faiths?
I think I'd say, first of all, I don't think it's a question of, it's not a question of balance. I want to be absolutely committed to both of those things. And I want to say that because of Jesus' command to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And I think following the command to love our neighbor as ourselves means that we will do both those things. We will share the good news of Jesus with them, and we will advocate for them to be protected and respected in terms of who they are, their cultural, their faith background, whatever it might be. So, I absolutely don't believe that we have to choose between the two. And actually, I also think that one of the very best ways that we can commend the gospel of Jesus Christ to other people is by being self-evidently loving of those people, not because we see them as evangelistic fodder, but because we see them as people who are worthy of respect and dignity and love and care in their own right. So I'm going to say, that we don't have to choose between those two things. I think maximum commitment to both is entirely possible if we take Jesus' words to love our neighbors ourselves seriously. Archbishop had his hand up.
I just want to one very quick story. In the 80s and 90s, there was a very influential Islamic cleric, Sheikh Sharawi, in Egypt, who would berate Christianity on a daily basis. He would issue videos and he was against, and it was horrible. It was horrible. It was targeted. It was consistent. That man fell ill and came to London to be treated. And the Pope at the time, Pope Shenouda, sent a message to his clergy. It was before I came, just before I came. I was still serving as the Pope's secretary, so I saw the other side of it. He sent a message to the clergy here and saying, please look after him. So we had a Coptic Orthodox medic who looked after him. The priest went and visited him in hospital. This man was the biggest attacker of Christianity in Egypt. He came back, and I was there with the Pope when he came, and he was a changed man. He came and he paid homage. He was almost sort of touching his clothes and saying, I'm here to take your blessing. This is the man who was swearing at us and making all kinds of lewd remarks about us. So as Bishop Philip said, it's not a choice. We often proclaim the gospel by the truth we speak in the love and meekness and honor that we present to other people. And that speaks volumes, and we don't need to do anything else.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add, what the other two have just said is this isn't a balance at all. It is part of the gospel. Sometimes people say to me, "Well, how can you protect people who are following Islam or Buddhism that is completely at odds to your Christian faith?" Well, it is quite simple, because I'm not, as I just said earlier, not protecting I'm not speaking up in defense of the faith. I'm speaking up in defense of the individual who I'm called to love. Listen, I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father. That's the gospel. I believe that. I believe in Easter that's coming up. I believe that Jesus died and rose again that we might live. That's what I believe, and I believe that will change people. But as Bishop Philip has just said, it is so when we speak up for people with whom we don't agree, when we be a good Samaritan, and when we speak up for our neighbour, that is missional. That is taking Jesus. In CSW, we say what we do because we're Christians.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you all for your contributions. I have another question. And again, I'll start with Merv, and then please do follow with the other panelists. It's from Lizzie, asking, what would you say is the most critical ongoing situation for freedom of religion or belief?
Oh, wow.
It's a big one.
Thanks for giving that to me. We could all, I think the three of us could give different answers to this, because there isn't an answer. The most critical problem or situation is waking the world up to what is happening. And I think we are beginning to see this. Political awareness of religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief is greater than it's ever been. When I started CSW, there were 2 or 3 members of Parliament who were interested in this. One of them, sadly, was the late David Amis, who we've just been remembering, particularly over the last couple of days. But today there are 150 members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief. We have a ministerial conference coming up in July of this year, which the British government is hosting, looking at freedom of religion or belief, where we hope to have around 70 foreign ministers coming from different countries to talk about this subject. So the awareness is great, but it's we that need to wake up now. And it's, as church leaders and those on this call and in our churches, I actually sadly think, and I don't know whether the other two will agree with me, I sadly think that there's more awareness politically than there is in the church. And I think we, as Christians, this is the critical situation in the world. We as Christians need to wake up, we need to stand up, and we need to speak out. And then we'll see the North Koreas, and then we'll see the Nigerias, and then we'll see the Eritreas and the Egypts and all of those countries, Pakistan and India. We'll see those begin to change, but we need to wake up. That's the critical situation.
Yes. If I can, Kiri, it's a really, really important question. I think Merv was talking about the genesis of CSW, and I suppose I first started getting involved in this a long time ago when I was a student at university, and we were praying for the persecuted church behind the Iron Curtain. And in those days, I mean, there were probably, let's be fair, there were probably other instances of the violation of freedom of religion or belief in other parts of the world that we didn't know about. But our focus was on that. And I suppose, the Cold War world brought these issues, gave a certain sort of simplicity, I suppose, to the issue. As I say, it may have been more complex than we realized at the time. But actually, where we are now is in quite a different place. And I think, this issue kind of went off our agenda after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. But actually, it has grown and grown very significantly in the intervening years. And one of the things that's really significant about it is that this is not a phenomenon that has a single driver. It has multiple drivers. So there are more than these, but three critical ones are militant nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and the rise of authoritarian governments. And often you get those things in a different mix as well. And on each of those, and those things together, can be real drivers in denying freedom of religion or belief, making life particularly uncomfortable and dangerous for minorities. And it is getting significantly worse. So, 10 years ago, China and India were not really particularly on the agenda, maybe a bit more than 10 years ago, but there was significant freedom in China, significant church growth, and you didn't hear about the kind of societal violence that we now hear about regularly in India. So multiple drivers and a deteriorating situation that we really have to be concerned about.
And I think a further problem is bandwidth. I think so much is going on. And if we just think about the last year, we started focusing on Syria, then it went to Iraq, then it went to Afghanistan, now it's Ukraine. And in the middle, you've had places like the Tigray region in Ethiopia, you've had Eritrea, and you've had Nigeria. We don't want to be like news corporations where when the cameras move, our attention moves. And that's why as church, as faith-based organizations, we have a bit more bandwidth and more longevity because we can look across the board. So I think what we must endeavor to do is not forget people just because there's no focus on them anymore in the media. And I think as NGOs and as advocacy organizations, we're going to have to start to looking at the work and trying to work more collaboratively, because at times we're all doing the same thing and then we're not doing other things. But I think if we can start working more collaboratively so we don't forget anyone or leave anyone behind, that would really be a good answer. Difficult, but I think it's the way forward.
Yeah, and just very briefly, one extra thing to it too that we've not touched on is the problem, and Philip mentioned China and India. I mean, India has got the worst record in the world for societal violence against religious minorities, and yet, governments, and this is the key thing, governments are very often frightened to call them out, particularly China and India, but because of trade. Trade is something that we need to as NGOs and as Christians and other NGOs, we need to be saying to governments, human rights and freedom of religion or belief must come before trade, must be an integral part of all trade negotiations. And so, when you've got two of the world's biggest economies who are violating freedom of religion and belief, we have to call them out, and governments have got an opportunity to do that in trade agreements.
Thank you, Mervyn. And thank you to all of our panelists. We've come to the end of today's webinar. I feel like there's so much more we could unpack and explore, but unfortunately it's coming to the end of our hour. And I did just want to, I think that final thought from the Archbishop about not maintaining that bandwidth, not just letting our attention flit with the changing of the headlines, I think is very important. And in terms of following up, please do keep an eye on your inbox, because our team will be following up with some practical ways in which you can respond to the issues you've heard today, and how church leaders can be a critical part of the global summit that Marvin mentioned on freedom of religion or belief that's coming up in July. There's 2 more events in the series on the 5th of May, 2 to 3 p.m. Examining religious persecution, does it occur in the UK? That will be with the Right Reverend Dr. Guli Francis Dekani, Bishop of Chelmsford. And we then have the 3rd event on the 25th of May, which will be religious freedom and the refugee crisis and the role of the church, how lack of freedom of religion or belief is often the root cause of forced migration. And we'll be joined for that by Dr. Krish Kandaya. We look forward to seeing you then, and thank you again to our brilliant panelists, the Archbishop Angelos, Bishop Philip, and Marvin Thomas of CSW. Thank you.